Chapter 14. Tomb of the Unknown King. The next morning, after Squall and Irvine had awoken, the three of them cleaned up their campsite and faced the entrance of the tomb. In the morning light, it was a lovely place. It was bright, covered in vines, and sparkling from the water that moved around it.
"We have a few hours,"
Squall said, moving towards it.
"Let's just get in and out as fast as we can." "Are we going for the GF?"
Rinoa asked, smiling as she moved over the path. Nothing had attacked them last night, but she still considered her first watch a perfect success. Squall shrugged, unconcerned.
"Do you want to?" "I do."
Irvine held up his hand, grinning at them.
"I've never held a GF before. We don't use them at Galbadia Garden. But if I'm hangin' with seeds, might as well learn, right?"
Squall looked at him for a moment before nodding.
"All right. We'll have to move faster then. I'll take the rear guard. Rinoa, you and Irvine."
"Ah." Squall had his shear trigger drawn and ready before Rinoa even realized what had happened. Irvine was slower than Squall, but only slightly. His new Ulysses was pulled out and aimed as two girls in Galbadia Garden uniforms came running, terrified and bleeding, from the tomb.
"Float!"
one was yelling desperately and uselessly. They both ran past the three of them and away from the tomb. Squall lowered his blade and looked at the thin blood trail one of them had left behind.
"Well, that's encouraging,"
Irvine said, leaning his gun up against his shoulder.
"Were they in there the whole night?"
Rinoa frowned, feeling unexpectedly guilty.
"Let's go,"
Squall said, choosing not to sheath his blade.
"Rinoa, you and Irvine take point. I'll watch our rear. Move quickly."
Wondering what made him think she was qualified to take point, Rinoa stepped forward in time with Irvine to move towards the tomb. Squall was just a step behind them. It was only knowing he was behind her, like a force moving her towards a cliff, that kept Rinoa going. The idyllic scene of the tomb on the outside couldn't have been more in contrast to the dark, cold, stone walls that seemed to suck all the life out on the inside. Everything was wet and damp from the twin streams running along beside the path. There was greenery, and the air was fresh-ish. It smelled like mold and mildew.
"I can't see,"
Rinoa said, frowning into the deep darkness before them. There were no lights, no cracks, no nothing to let in any sort of light.
"I got you,"
came Irvine's voice from the darkness.
"Rule number 1 at Galbadia Garden, always be prepared."
As he laughed, a light from a scope appeared. He winked at Rinoa and attached it to the barrel of his Ulysses. He then kept it forward, grinning.
"And that, ladies, is how you do it. They don't teach you preparedness at Balam, Squall."
Irvine grinned over his shoulder at the seed captain.
"Yeah. I brought a Galbadian student for my light."
Squall returned, earning a dull look from Irvine and a laugh from Rinoa. He turned from him to her, watching the way her eyes lit up at his words. This was getting dangerous fast. He was quickly becoming accustomed to the sound of her laughing at his jokes. It was definitely not good to get attached to something like that. He was only going to miss it that much more when it inevitably stopped coming. Note to self: stop making jokes. This was worse when no one understood or laughed.
"Squall, where are we going?"
Rinoa asked as she looked around the damp stones surrounding her. She was suddenly fiercely glad that she wasn't claustrophobic. Even without that fear, it almost felt like the walls were closing in around her. Squall pulled the map, which was rather unhelpful, from his pocket and looked it over.
Well, it's all basically just two big circles connected by 4 spokes. So it shouldn't be too hard to know where we are so long as we keep track of all our turns. I don't know how far in the Galbadian student made it, so we're going to have to comb through each section carefully. Yeah,
Irvine said.
Or we could just stop right here a couple meters from the entrance.
Squall looked up and caught sight of the shining metal of a discarded saber on the ground. Beside it was a Galbadia Garden uniform jacket that had been stained with what looked suspiciously like dried blood and a broken PDA. The 3 of them stepped close and Rinoa leaned down. She made a face but didn't hesitate to reach into the jacket pockets of the discarded clothing. In the inner pocket, she pulled out a school ID and a picture of a smiling girl with short brown hair.
Ah, he had a girlfriend,
Rinoa said sadly, stroking the picture.
ID number,
Squall reminded her.
Oh. Right. 154. Want me to write it down? I've got it. Well, that's technically all we need. Not too late to turn back, Kinias.
Psh.
Please.
Irvine gave him a look.
I'm not scared of a GF, no matter how big a mover and shaker he is. Let's keep going. We're not quitting halfway through,
Squall warned him.
If we're doing this, we're doing it. Try not to fall behind,
Irvine agreed. Rinoa looked between them, noticing the sudden tension in the air around them. Like they were measuring each other. Squall, a proven seed, and Irvine, from Galbadia Garden. The garden that strived without admitting it to be like Balam Garden. They did their best to surpass them and never seemed to be able to cross into the territory that Seed resided in. Rinoa knew for a fact that Galbadia instructors told their students that they were better than Seed. They weren't heartless mercenaries. They had honor and integrity. They were going into the all-powerful Galbadian military unlike the money-hungry, disloyal Seeds who worked for anyone that would meet their price. She could practically see Irvine oozing that confidence. That arrogance. He wanted to test Squall just as much as Squall wanted to test him. To prove he was better than Seed. Rinoa had never seen Irvine fight before. She didn't know how he compared to Squall. However, she had seen Squall fight. She had seen him take down Galbadian soldiers and monsters alike with almost equal ease. If she was putting Gil on the contest.
Rinoa. Yes.
She stood up quickly, looking at Squall.
Call Angelo in here. Hey. Why? He'll be useful. Call him in here.
Rinoa hesitated for a moment. Her dog had been following them since Timber. He would stay out of the way of monsters unless he felt Rinoa was in danger. They hadn't really been seeing much of him, but that didn't mean he wasn't here. Rinoa lifted her fingers to her mouth and let out a single, ear-busting whistle. It echoed down the halls and out of the tomb. It didn't take long for her to hear the clack of claws against stone. She turned and faced her dog with a big smile.
Hey, Angelo,
she said, leaning down to pet his head.
Where did that dog come from?
Irvine frowned.
Rinoa, keep him with us. Sure, but why? I told you before. Dogs are excellent at alerting people of danger and you told me that he was good at tracking. It's too dark in here to rely on a single flashlight. Angelo's nose will come in handy. And we might be able to use him to track down this GF.
At the sound of Squall's voice, Angela turned to growl at him. Squall bared his teeth slightly in return, incising the dog further. Rinoa frowned, rubbing the thick fur at his neck.
Angelo? What's wrong with you? It's just Squall.
That did nothing to ease the dog's anger.
Let's keep going,
Squall said.
We'll make sure that Angelo doesn't get hurt, Rinoa. Just make sure he's keeping on lookout. Angelo,
Rinoa took her dog's head and made him look her in the eye.
Nose up, boy. Stay alert.
Angelo gave no sign that he heard her, but Rinoa stood up, confident that he understood. Squall didn't question her about it either. He stood back and let the pair of them take point, ignoring the dark look Angelo gave him as he passed by.
So, I'm no expert on canines,
Irvine said softly,
but I don't think that dog likes you. Whatever,
Squall murmured, keeping pace with Rinoa. At the first turn in the tomb, Squall allowed Irvine to pick which direction he wanted to go. This was, essentially, his mission after all. After a moment of deliberation, Irvine pointed to the right and they decided to follow the circle around and visit the ends of each spokes. The only way to find this thing was to be thorough. A couple times as they were walking, Angelo would stop dead and his ears and nose would twitch as he sensed something beyond their perception. Whenever he did so, the other three would immediately stop and see if whatever it was came in closer.
This place is creepy,
Rinoa said, rubbing her cold arms after the third such display. Angelo was walking just ahead of them, bathed in Irvine's light, as he sniffed his way down the seemingly endless turns of the maze.
Don't worry, beautiful,
Irvine winked at her.
I'll protect you. Thanks.
Rinoa said, confused.
Focus, Kineas,
Squall told him coldly.
Dude, I think you're an ice monster,
Irvine grumbled, shivering.
Why is everything always so cold around you? Maybe you're just scared,
Squall suggested calmly, making Rinoa giggle. In his head, Shiva felt satisfaction at his chill. That's what he got for constantly coming on to women who didn't appreciate or invite such actions. The slight tinge of possessiveness for Rinoa in particular was ignored by Squall. Even if it was technically his and not Shiva's. The deeper into the tomb they went, the more Squall started to be able to hear what was alerting Angelo. The dog, then himself, would start stopping and listening at the same moment. It was almost funny, in a way, for Rinoa to watch. Squall even had a fur collar, just like Angelo. She wondered if he would be as receptive to being pet. The sudden mental image of her rubbing his belly had her laughing to herself. Laughter that quickly faded when she remembered what his belly looked like and she realized that she would enjoy rubbing his abdomen probably far more than he would. The boys gave her a look about the random laughter that stopped as suddenly as it began. Neither of them questioned it though as they turned into what, Squall believed, was the first spoke of the tomb wheel. The noises were coming from behind them and Squall turned in time to see something run past the hall they had turned into. It had moved too fast to make out what it was. Squall! Rinoa turned to him when she heard his footsteps stop.
Let's just keep going,
Squall told her, backing up. Squall didn't know what to expect at the end of the spoke. The map wasn't very helpful. It showed that there was a room there, but not what it might hold.
Whoa, look,
Rinoa beamed as she came inside ahead of them.
A statue. Kind of an ugly thing,
Irvine made a face at it. Squall stepped forward between them towards the statue. Standing upon a thick stone platform covered in old, unreadable symbols, the statue looked like a cross between a bovine and a man. A pair of thick, heavy horns adorned its head and it wore what looked like very old-style armor. The craftsman of the statue had been very thorough in carving it. Squall could almost pick out individual hairs even in this dark gloom. Squall frowned as he came in closer. He heard Rinoa moving around the room behind him while Irvine shined the light about. Angelo stayed in the entrance though, growling into the empty room.
"There's nothing else in here,"
Rinoa was saying. The statue was staring straight ahead at nothing. Through Squall. But its eyes. Stone didn't shine like that. Squall blinked at the slight breeze of warm air. Breeze. Stop. Breeze. Stop. Like it was breathing. The eyes blinked.
"It's alive!"
Squall yelled, jumping back. He wasn't fast enough. The statue's fist shot out and slammed against Squall's chest. He cried out in pain as his body flew back. He heard Rinoa cry out as Irvine clicked the safety on his gun. Squall was pushing himself up as the statue stood up straight and roared.
"Who goes there?" "It's the GF,"
Squall warned, climbing back up. Irvine let out 2 quick shots as the GF climbed down from his platform. The ground seemed to tremble as his hooves hit the stone. The bullets did nothing but bounce off of its stone-like skin. The GF slammed its fist to the ground and the stone buckled. Squall, just on his feet, hit the ground as it rippled under him. Rinoa was thrown back against the wall and Irvine caught himself just before falling on his face. Angelo was backing up, growling. The GF ignored them and pulled his fist from the ground. He was pulling something with it when he did. A long stone staff turned into a heavy, large stone mace with long, wicked spikes. It held the weapon in its hands, growling at them.
"Die, intruders!"
The GF charged, swinging out his mace as he did so. Squall ducked and rolled to avoid getting pummeled and trampled. When he came up again, he had his gun blade at the ready. Rinoa was already shooting off her Valkyrie as Irvine unloaded rounds from Ulysses. The Guardian's thick skin just absorbed the force of the blows without being affected. It turned, snarling at Squall as he was the one who had gotten closest.
"Rinoa! Diablos, now!"
Right." She closed her eyes and reached into herself. Squall dove out of the way. The beast was focusing on him. Irvine cursed as he opened his shotgun and pulled out a new ammo pack.
"Squall, watch yourself! I'm using my demo ammo."
"What?" Squall let out an involuntary cry as he felt the wind coming off of the giant mace as it passed right by his arm. That one had been too close. Irvine chuckled to himself as he opened his package of demolition ammunition. It was his heavy-duty firepower. These babies could knock a hole in a concrete wall. Irvine jerked his hand back, snapping the barrel back in place. Laughing, he took a quick aim and let off all 4 rounds in quick succession. The first burst against the GF's shoulder armor but caught his attention. The second hit his arm. The third half hit his shoulder, half missed. By then he was turning and the final shot landed square on his chest. Each blow drove him back slightly. Irvine dropped back to reload. The GF roared in anger and jumped. When it came down, it slammed into the stone ground with far too much power for even its large size. The ground buckled again, rippling almost like it was water. Rinoa cried out as her concentration was broken and she was thrown down. Squall still couldn't make it to his feet. And Irvine lost control of his weapon. It slipped from his fingers as he fell backwards and skidded away from him on the rocking earth. Squall stood up quickly, breathing fast. A real mover and shaker. Ha! So funny. What was the other hint again? Laughing at them with a deep, rumbling voice like boulders bashing together, the GF looked between the three prone humans.
Weaklings!
It roared at them.
I won't let you deface this tomb.
It started jumping again and they all cried out. The ground was rocking, shaking, and the three of them were getting tossed around like feathers in a storm. Worse than that, the stone ground was actually pummeling them as they came back down on top of it. Rinoa was crying out in pain. Squall was doing his best to protect his head. Irvine, who had bounced near the pedestal, was trying to hang on to the side and keep himself from being knocked around. In the hallway, Squall heard Angelo cry out in distress at hearing his mistress's yelps of pain. The GF wasn't extending his power that far. The dog was staying out of it. But he was dancing at the edge, looking like he dearly wanted to change that fact.
Squall!
Rinoa called out desperately as she was knocked between the wall and the ground. Damn! He needed that GF to stop moving.
Shiva! Blizzard!
Squall yelled, throwing out the spell rather clumsily. The spire of ice that erupted from the earth missed the GF. However, with his next jump, he shattered the column and the shards of ice that flew slammed into his face, eyes, and ears. Crying out, he stopped and fell back. The earth calmed. Squall jumped to his feet, ignoring the way his bruised and battered body complained at the movement. It didn't last long anyway. Shiva gave him a cure spell and he was only stiff, not pained, from the beating. Growling, the GF sent Squall a dark, hate-filled look. He brought back his mace and lifted it. Like he was going to slam it to the ground. Stay above ground. That was it.
Rinoa! Cast float! Now!
Her immediate instinct to question the order was tempered by all the fighting she had been doing with him recently. He gave an order in battle and she followed it. Reaching out for Diablos again, she threw her hand towards Squall.
Float!
The effect was instantaneous and more than a little disorienting. Squall's belly dropped like he had just fallen down the stairs even as his body rose. He didn't float very high, just off the ground. He scrambled for a second, but he didn't need to. It almost felt like he was walking on the air. Or swimming through water. The GF charged at him and Squall jumped to the side. And he flew away. He twisted in the air reflexively and his feet hit the wall like a feather. He wasn't just floating. He was practically weightless.
Float!
Rinoa threw the spell at herself this time. She cried out in surprise as his body came up off of the ground. She twisted awkwardly, trying to hold onto the wall like she might fall off of it.
Hey! What about me?
Irvine asked as the GF changed direction and charged towards him.
How about some love for the sniper, eh?
Grinning, Rinoa turned towards him and said, much more confidently, float. Irvine's body detached from the ground and he made a sound of surprise as he clung tighter, for just a moment, to the pedestal. The GF was still charging him down. Irvine let go and tried to push himself away. The GF was right on top of him, the mace pulled back. Squall's cry was somehow louder than the beast's as he landed against his back and slammed the gun blade down. He had no weight to put behind it, so it was only muscle strength. The GF cried out as a long red mark opened and blood came spilling out. Using the GF as a springboard, Squall launched himself away as it turned and swung wildly for him. Squall floated out of his reach and landed above the opening of the door. He crouched there, his hair floating around his head as he grinned.
Worthless nuisance!
The GF started jumping again and the three of them braced themselves, wincing in anticipation of the pain. The earth rocked around them. The walls groaned in protest as the bedrock shifted. Irvine felt almost seasick seeing the way the normally stable earth rippled. It was somehow disturbing to see, even as he knew it was magic that manipulated the stone. Yet, despite that, the rocking earth didn't touch them. Floating as they were, all three of them were safe out of harm's way. Rinoa laughed in delight as she realized she wasn't getting thrown around. The sound of it focused the GF's angry eyes on her. Roaring, it charged her down. Rinoa cried out and tried to swim in the air instead of pushing against the ground. Panic lit up her face as the stone mace was raised above her head. Squall leapt from the wall like a bullet from a gun. He shot forward and twisted in the air. His gun blade came up as his body hit the ground. The mace came down and Squall grunted at the sudden force of the heavier weapon slamming into him.
Squall!
Rinoa cried out.
Irvine! Move her!
Squall yelled as he and the GF struggled against each other. Irvine pushed away from the far wall. He skidded to a stop behind Squall, grabbed Rinoa's arm, then pushed off again, dragging her with him. He released her before he hit the other wall. He landed. She did not. She was left sort of flailing out in the air.
Irvine! Don't just leave me here!
She snapped, twisting, trying to make her body obey.
You'll be safe there,
he said, winking at her.
Leave this one to Squall and me, baby. Irvine, you,
Rinoa growled, turning to look back at Squall.
You think to match me in a battle of strength?
The GF growled at Squall. He sounded amused at the thought.
You've got guts, human.
Squall couldn't respond. His arms were shaking, his teeth clenched, as he tried to keep the enormous and heavily muscled GF from crushing him with his mace.
Demo ammo, baby!
Irvine laughed, letting out 2 quick shots. Squall dropped and rolled just in time to miss the mace crashing through his head and the spreading shotgun blast from peppering his body. He jumped up and floated to the ceiling. He gave Irvine a dirty look as the GF let out a cry of pain.
Who were you trying to hit, Kinias? I told you to watch out before, didn't I?
Irvine smirked.
You should be able to dodge that, shouldn't you, Seed?
Squall, deciding this was something best dealt with later, turned back to the GF. He was swatting at his face and chest, growling at the pinpricks of blood that had appeared at the shot. As though he could sense Squall's gaze, he looked up and grinned. Then Squall watched as the wounds sealed themselves shut. Metal balls from the shotgun blast clinked against the ground as they were forced from his body. The long slash along his back healed, leaving only a small bloodstain to prove it had ever been there. The GF laughed at their expressions.
I am Minotaur. I am the Earth. And I cannot be killed so long as I'm connected to it. You're going to die here, humans. The sanctity of this tomb shall remain and honorless grave robbers shall be killed.
Rearing back, Minotaur let out a cry as he threw his mace forward. Irvine barely dodged being impaled on its spikes. It slammed into the wall, spraying rock shards. Rinoa cried out, covering her face as a few of the shards opened tiny nicks on her skin.
Rinoa! Diablos!
Squall reminded her.
Right.
Trying to ignore the fact that she was still floating out in the middle of the room with no way to move, Rinoa closed her eyes and reached once again for Diablos. Minotaur leapt in the air, grabbing for Squall. He missed him by a hair as Squall jumped to the side and landed against the wall. Irvine was reloading. Squall lifted his own blade and fired 3 times in quick succession. Irvine fired a second later. Minotaur covered his eyes and face as the hail of bullets rained down over him. Irvine's shots peppered his back, Squall spread out across his arms and chest. The streams of blood, the armor-piercing and demolition ammo opened-closed against almost as quickly. Minotaur was laughing at them as he lowered his arms. Rinoa's eyes opened again, burning red. Turning in the air, feeling suddenly right at home being weightless, she threw out her hand as the power of gravity warped in the room.
Dark Messenger!
Minotaur cried out. He was of the earth, he was even more susceptible to gravity than even the heavily armored monsters had been. It crushed him to the ground, stealing the breath from his lungs as his bones cracked under the force. He tried to cry out, but couldn't. His body nearly flattened on the ground as Diablos's magic slammed down against him. And, at the same time, he was curing himself just as quickly. Squall cursed to himself to see Minotaur raising to his feet, already healing, as the gravity spell wore off.
You're kidding!
Rinoa bemoaned.
How are we supposed to kill that thing?
Irvine asked, reloading again. Squall cast his mind around quickly. For defeating opponents that were able to heal, the easiest thing was to inflict more damage than their healing magic could repair. In other words, simply overload it by destruction. That clearly wasn't working here. Which meant that they needed to find another option. In this case, remove what was making him heal. Keep him above ground.
Rinoa! Cast float on Minotaur. What? Just do it.
Rinoa resisted the urge to question him further and just threw her magic at Minotaur.
Float.
The 3 humans hadn't reacted well initially to the power of the float spell. The Earth Guardian, whose power came from the stone beneath his feet, reacted even worse. Minotaur cried out as his hooves separated from the ground. He thrashed about, reaching for the stone again, but couldn't move back towards it. Float was separating him completely from the ground. He moved awkwardly, like he might not even know how to swim.
Oh, yeah.
Irvine laughed, unloading his shotgun into the beast. Minotaur roared in pain. His blood dripped to the floor, but the ammo that could tear a hole in a concrete wall merely dug divots into his body. Minotaur turned and roared at Irvine, kicking out his limbs in an attempt to reach him.
Shiva, give me arrow on my blade,
Squall instructed, crouching low. He felt her acquiescence and a cold breeze started up from the metal saber. Wind was Earth's opposite. Its weakness. Squall cried out and launched himself from the wall. He sliced across Minotaur's back in passing. The GF's back arched and he turned, swinging. Squall was already gone. He landed against the ground, pushed off again, and sliced across Minotaur's side. He hit the corner of the room. Pushed back. Struck against Minotaur's shoulder and neck. His body raced past too quick to catch. He landed again against the earth and brought up his blade again, twirling it around him. Magic erupted from the tip, encircling him. Squall stopped, his gun blade aimed dead center at Minotaur's chest. The magic crackled around him, lighting up the room with bright red and orange spheres of power. They contained all of the heat that Shiva absorbed to maintain her chill. The power echoed into the barrel of his gun as Squall took aim. The armor-piercing magic shot of the gunblade. All power, burning energy, concentrated into a single point of penetration that exploded upon impact and decimated flesh and metal. Fated circle. Squall's finger jerked against the trigger and the magic all discharged at once. Minotaur roared out in pain and fury as the concentrated energy burst through his body. The large flash of light and smoke that followed obscured their vision.
"You'll pay for this!"
Minotaur roared through the smoke. Squall felt something rush past him and he sliced out quickly. He felt his blade hit something, but it was too late to prevent him from escaping. The air settled down and the light faded from their eyes and Minotaur was gone.
"Seriously?"
Irvine yelled loudly.
"Squall, you let it get away."
Squall resisted the urge to tell Phineas to stuff it. He maintained his silence as he slid his gun blade back into its sheath. The float spell wore off and he felt his weight settle back down around him. It was actually rather comforting to have weight, substance, again.
"That was incredible, Squall,"
Rinoa praised as her weight started coming back to her. She returned to the ground gently, beaming at him.
"What was that?" "A heat-based magic shot." "Hey? But I thought Shiva hated the heat." "She does. To keep herself cold, she uses the heat to generate cold. It's kind of backwards. However, she often absorbs more than she needs. I can discharge that in a gunshot I call Fated Circle." "That was amazing."
Rinoa laughed, walking over to him as Irvine came back to earth.
"Can Diablos do something like that?" "I don't know. You only obtain that knowledge by working with him for a long time."
Irvine hit the ground again and dusted himself off.
"That's all well and good, but the GF got away. He's not going to leave the tomb." "Yeah, how do you know that?" "Because this is his home. GF don't like to leave their places of security. And the way he spoke. He considers himself a guardian of this place against grave robbers. He can't do that if he abandons it. So he's still here. We just need to find him." "And how do you propose we do so?"
Irvine crossed his arms. Squall turned to the entrance where Angelo was coming in, running for Rinoa. He was whimpered and she leaned down to rub his head and assure him that she was fine.
"Rinoa, Angelo can track based on scent, right?" "Oh, yeah."
Her eyes lit up.
"Squall, you're a genius. Okay, boy. Smell that."
Obligingly, Angelo lifted his head and took a few sniffs of the air. To be sure, Rinoa led him over to the pedestal where Minotaur had been standing.
"Find him, Angelo,"
Rinoa ordered excitedly. Angelo put his nose to the ground and started sniffing. He followed Minotaur's trail to the door, then barked. Just like that, he started running. Squall chased after him, the others just a step behind. He was trying to keep the turns they took in his head to make sure he didn't get lost. It was hard to do since Angelo was so set on tracking the scent. He took them around the wheel and towards the center. The sudden flash of light from outside blinded them after so long in the dark, and Squall had to shield his eyes as he stepped from the tomb and out onto a ledge above the stream that wound around the tomb. Across the water, centered in the middle of the river and the circular tomb, there was a tall, circular room. The drawbridge to reach it had been pulled up and there was nowhere to swim across. Angelo barked at the drawbridge.
"He's in there?"
Rinoa asked, petting Angelo's head.
"Squall."
He thought for a second.
"If there's a bridge, there must be a way to lower it from this side. There's still 2 more rooms out here. We'll go to each one and see if we can find a switch of some kind. We only have a couple more hours to finish this and get back to Deling City. Let's not dawdle."
They stepped away from the ledge and back into the darkness of the tomb. After a moment of debate, they decided to go right and come back around past Minotaur's room. Finding the second room was easier than finding the first. There was an exit outside here and the light beckoned them closer when they came around the hallway.
"It's a water wheel,"
Rinoa said, stepping out onto the ledge.
"It's connected to these cogs."
Irvine pointed to the cogs that Squall was already silently investigating on his own. His eyes followed the path of the cogs up to a chain in the ceiling. This was the closest thing they had found to a switch as yet. He moved outside with Rinoa, following the wheels of the cogs.
"We need to get the water wheel moving,"
Squall said at last, laying his hand against the old wood of the wheel. He looked down at the base of the wheel, but the stone channel there was bone dry. It might have been connected to the stream, but there was no water running through it. Turning around, Squall looked to see where the dry bed originated from. It continued around the side of the building and turned right, towards the back. One last room. The 3 of them made their way that way. Angelo's ears kept twitching along with Squall's hand on his gunblade. Something was moving out in the tomb and Squall couldn't figure out if it was chasing them or not. They reached the hallways leading to the back room, lit again with light from the outside. But Irvine grabbed Rinoa's arm and stopped her from moving closer.
"What is it?"
she asked, frowning.
"Squall, does that look like water to you?"
Irvine asked, pointing. Squall moved closer and frowned at the blue liquid on either side of the path. It almost looked like the streams that flowed through the rest of the tomb. There was something different though. Even in the sunlight it looked too shiny. Too blue. Squall crouched down and picked up a pebble from the ground. He stood and tossed it. It didn't splash into the water. It kind of smacked against it before slowly lowering down. The water didn't ripple as it sank. It jiggled like jelly.
"Blobra,"
Irvine made a face.
"We need to be careful. Those things are tough. Don't even have real skin. Hitting them does nothing. And I think that one has set itself up as a trap there." "It's not a big deal,"
Squall shrugged.
"Rinoa, time to practice your magic. Blobras are weak against it, though it varies from Blobra to Blobra which spell will work best. Fire is usually a good start though. Burn it." "Right,"
she nodded, rubbing her hands together.
"Diablos, fire."
She threw out her hand and a blast of fire shot from her palm. The Blobra let out a scream that quickly faded as the fire burned it away. A curious smell like a cross between burning rubber and burning sugar filled the air and they all made a face. But the sound of water running filled the tunnel as the place where the Blobra had been waiting ran with it once again.
"Whoa,"
Irvine breathed.
"That sucks. I once spent an hour beating my head against a Blobra and all it would have taken was some magic. That's it, I really want a GF now."
Squall walked past the blubber trap first, to make sure it was truly clear and there had only been one, but Rinoa was just a step behind him. Irvine was still grumbling about time wasted as he followed them into the last of the tomb chambers.
Squall, floodgates.
Rinoa pointed eagerly to the water being kept at bay by a large concrete door being held up with a metal chain. The dry stream bed below looked familiar.
Sweet, let's open them and get out of here,
Irvine grinned. Squall was already walking around to where the chain was anchored. He frowned at the way it was bolted into the wall. It required a key to open.
Should we try to find it?
Rinoa asked, peering over his shoulder at the lock. Squall cast her a gaze before looking at the metal. It was kind of old, slightly rusted. Squall would bet that, even with a key, that lock might not open.
Shiva, Blizzara. What?
Rinoa blinked at the unfamiliar spell. Squall lifted his hand and put it over the lock. A sudden and strong chill filled the air as the lock froze over under Squall's grasp. The metal groaned as the ice coated in and through it. A cold so deep that it actually disturbed the physical structure of the old metal. Squall stepped back and pulled out his gun blade. He turned it around and swung down. The pommel of the gun smashed against the frozen lock. Metal and ice shards exploded outwards as the sudden impact destroyed both. The ice was thawing even as it hit the ground. Such an intense cold wasn't meant to last for long periods.
What was that?
Rinoa asked, awed.
That wasn't your normal blizzard spell. No, it was stronger. I've used it to break metal and stone before. I don't have that many of them though, so I try to conserve them.
As he spoke, Squall was reaching out for the concrete slab. Irvine was on the other side, grabbing for the other end. Working together, the two of them pushed the slab out, down and out of its years-old resting place. Water started rushing past them and down through the stream bed.
All right,
Irvine fist pumped.
Let's go get me my GF. Let's check to make sure it worked first,
Squall corrected.
Why do you gotta ruin my mood? It's called being practical. It's called being boring. But, whatever, practical. Let's go check to make sure it worked.
Back in the second room, the water wheel was not turning.
What?
Irvine's mouth fell open as they came inside.
You gotta be kidding me. This is why we checked,
Squall said as Rinoa laughed. Crap. He had done it again. Ignoring her mirth, he walked outside again to check the water wheel. The stream bed was filled to the brim with rushing water. However, the water wheel was still within it. Wondering if it had gotten stuck, Squall reached out and grabbed it. He moved it quickly back and forth. It didn't feel stuck, it almost felt like it had been locked in place so it couldn't turn.
Hey, Squall,
Rinoa called out from within.
Do that again.
He grabbed the wheel once more and rocked it again, looking through the door at her. She nodded and pointed.
This cog keeps trying to move when you do that, but this cog here is getting in the way and it can't.
Releasing the wheel, he moved inside and followed where her fingers pointed. She was right. One of the cogs, slightly different from the others, was locking everything together. It almost looked like it wasn't even supposed to be there. Squall reached forward and took protruding handle in its center in hand. He jerked up, against the force of the water wheel pressing against it. Once. Twice. On the third jerk, it slipped free and, Like a well-oiled machine, the cogs all started turning again. Squall lowered the locking cog to the floor as the chain into the ceiling turned. From the halls, distantly, he heard the heavy thud of something slamming against the ground.
"All right. Now let's go."
He nodded, satisfied.
"Think you're so smart,"
Irvine said snarkily as he led the way out. Rinoa was chuckling. Somehow, as they had moved through the tomb, she had stopped walking beside Irvine, and now, when they exited, she was beside Squall once more. She was smiling, holding her elbows behind her back, as she walked beside him. Like they were taking a stroll through a park instead of a tomb. And that smile was directed right at him. He caught her eye and tried not to feel uncomfortable. It was a losing battle. He just wasn't used to nor welcome to having someone look at him that way.
"You should be keeping watch,"
he said before turning away to look around.
"Squall, tell me something." "No." "When do you relax?" "What? When do you relax?"
she repeated, emphasizing the words carefully.
"You know, that thing you do when you're not constantly on guard and you enjoy yourself." "I know what relaxing means." "Oh, good. So when do you do it?" "Usually not when I'm in an ancient tomb hunting down a GF and keeping my eyes out for blobras." "Don't be a smart ass,"
she laughed.
"Come on, you have to have some place that you relax. Like a library or a beach or something. I hear Balam's beaches are beautiful." "I usually visit the beach to use the sand as resistance training or to fight water monsters." "Of course you do. I don't suppose you use libraries to fight book monsters." "Book monsters?"
He gave her a dull look, making her laugh again.
"I use libraries for studying and research. As most other people do." "Squall, you can't be on all the time. You have to take a break at some point. So? Talk to me." "You're supposed to be keeping watch."
He would really rather not have this conversation. With her or with anyone. What did it even matter anyway? A flash of movement at the end of the hall caught his eye. His body tensed.
"How about a hobby? Everybody needs a hobby. Personally, I love reading." "There, I just gave you something about me. Now it's your turn." "Rinoa, hush,"
he ordered, his eyes moving around quickly. Another flash of movement. To their side this time.
"No. See, that's your problem. You actively try to keep away from people. Well, Squall Leonhardt, I'm not going to let you push me away. I'm going to." "Seriously, be quiet,"
he repeated, his voice low but urgent. There. Again. Too fast to be just a single monster circling them. There had to be at least 2 or 3.
"No way. I'm not dropping the subject until you give me something. So help me Squall, I am going to make you like me if I have to."
Squall grabbed her wrist and yanked her back so quickly that she didn't have time to react. All she knew was that she was suddenly pressed up against his chest, and this conversation had gone way better than she had originally intended. Then she felt the rush of air behind her as one of the monsters stalking them ran past. She heard the click of its claws on stone. Her eyes lifted from Squall's neck and looked over to see something dark and heavily armored running around the corner. Irvine, who had fallen out of the way barely in time, jumped up to his feet again.
"What was that?" he
asked, looking around.
"There's more than one,"
Squall said, releasing a blushing Rinoa.
They've got us boxed in.
Her heart was beating fast in her chest. She knew he was just doing his job, keeping her safe as best he could while training her. At the same time, it was hard to tell her rampaging emotions something so logical. All she could think was that he had grabbed her and, for however brief a moment it had been, he had embraced her. Somehow, she couldn't see him doing the same to Irvine had the situations been reversed. Then again, he might have just let the monster hit Irvine. Maybe Irvine was a bad example.
You all right?
Squall asked her, his sharp eyes not missing how flushed or out of breath she suddenly was. He hoped the monster hadn't hit her and he didn't notice.
I'm okay,
she said, smiling quickly.
Thank you.
He nodded once, accepting her gratitude as he drew his sword.
They're coming again. You still alive, Phineas? Of course I am, Seed.
Irvine snapped, getting to his feet and pulling out his gun.
How about a little warning next time, eh? I thought Galbadian students were always prepared.
Irvine growled as Rinoa laughed. Damn. He was making her smile again. Why couldn't she just not get his dry sense of humor, or be annoyed at it, like everyone else? Rinoa squeaked in surprise when Squall grabbed her for the second time in so many minutes. This time though, instead of pulling her in, he pushed her backwards. She nearly fell into the stream beside the walkway and only didn't because he had wrapped his arm around her to prevent just that from happening. Oh, and another monster ran by. That was probably more important. For the life of her, probably literally, she just couldn't stop thinking about the way he kept holding her.
Phineas, shoot the next one that charges,
Squall ordered, stepping back away from Rinoa, struggling not to think of how soft and warm her body was. She was a distraction and he was going to end up killed because of her. It was worth it if he could keep feeling her sweet, pliant body in his arms. Maybe he was indulging a little much as he saved her, but he was allowed to enjoy himself. No matter what Shiva might say in discouragement about time and place.
Demo ammo.
Irvine grinned.
Demo ammo.
Squall's eyes moved around quickly scanning with sight and sound to try to detect where the quickly running monsters might be coming from. They were circling them. Deliberately. Irvine was in a similar position as he loaded his gun. He clicked the barrel back in place. Even Rinoa was trying to keep track of where the monsters were. Angelo, staying close to her, was low to the ground, growling at the amount of sensory information coming in. Squall and Angelo noticed the monster charging first. He gave out a cry of warning, reaching behind himself to grab hold of Rinoa. Unnecessary, if pleasant, because the monster had targeting Irvine this time.
Got you,
Irvine grinned. The loud blast of the shotgun echoed painfully in the narrow corridor. However, the demolition ammo had the intended effect. The charging monster's momentum was negated with the force of the bullets crashing against its armored head. The force against its brain sent the thing to its knees and the four-legged beast skidded to a stop at their feet. Armored all along its head and body, wicked sharp claws gleamed at the end of its hands. Its head was tiny in relation to its body and its shell was so thick that the demo ammo had only dented it, getting stuck in some places.
What is it?
Rinoa frowned at the beast. It was still breathing.
An armadillo,
Irvine said, looking it over.
Don't have these beasties in Balam, do you, Seed? No, but I've fought them before on trips to Galbadia,
Squall said, lifting his blade.
That shell is almost impenetrable. But its underbelly is totally vulnerable.
He slammed the tip of his shear trigger down and through the downed monster's heart. As it died, roars of anger echoed through the tomb. Its pack lamenting his death.
Ugh, Hein, Squall. Why do you gotta play so perfect?
Irvine asked, making a disgusted face. Squall frowned. And what was that supposed to mean? Quick thumping of feet against stone alerted them a second before the next Armadillo charged from the opposite end of the hall. Irvine didn't get his gun up in time. Squall flipped his blade and smacked against the rampaging monster's legs. As it flew past him, Squall kicked it in the air. The Armadillo landed belly up, struggling against the rigidity of its own shell to lift its body. Irvine took that opportunity to shoot it in the heart. See? Irvine gestured to him.
That's what I mean. You look like an instructional video. I've seen Zell throwing punches and he doesn't look nearly so robotic as you. Sorry for my efficient and well-aimed blows,
Squall said dully. Irvine growled.
That is not what I meant and you know it.
Squall had no idea what he meant. He didn't even understand what had prompted this rather random and confusing conversation. He did his job expeditiously and without unnecessary drivel. How did that make him bad?
Irvine, maybe now isn't the best time,
Rinoa started.
Rinoa, sweetie, not now. If you have time to grill him about hobbies, I can ask what's wrong with him and why he can't act like a human. Don't yell at her,
Squall said quite calmly. Another Armadillo started towards them. Squall lifted his blade and let out a shot that made the beast rear back in pain. As it was up, Rinoa shot off her weapon and sliced it clear through the neck. Its body joined its fallen brethren and they had to move around it to keep going forward.
So she talks and you don't say a word, but you snap at me.
Irvine growled, reloading. What was his problem? Squall had told Rinoa to be quiet as well. In fact, he had been ruder to her than he was being to Irvine now.
You seeds are so damn arrogant,
Irvine shook his head.
I can't stand how superior you all think you are. That, right there. That look. You're looking down on me. Well, I'm not going to let it slide like she does. I'm not afraid of you.
Squall lifted his gun blade, drawing back his arm. Irvine felt his heart stop as he took aim at him. Squall was going to kill him for that. And all he would need to do was kill the lone witness to get away with it. Squall threw his sword and it sailed through the air. He wasn't going to kill him that easily. Irvine let out a shot, his eyes closed and his body tense. Waiting for death. Rinoa's cry opened his eyes again. The Armadillo that had been charging at him was collapsed almost at his feet, Squall's blade still wiggling in its throat. Squall had dropped to his knee, blood from the gunshot wound that had largely missed him pouring down his arm and onto the ground. He reached up and grabbed his right shoulder as Rinoa dropped down beside him. Squall! She started to reach for him then stopped.
Diablos, cure!
Blue light arched from her hand to Squall's wound. Squall's face was drawn slightly in pain, but he hadn't even cried out when he had gotten hit. Irvine looked between him and the Armadillo, realization setting in. He had just shot an innocent man that had saved his life at the same moment.
I'm fine,
Squall was telling Rinoa, trying to keep her from touching the blood-soaked leather of the jacket. A benefit of black, blood didn't stain.
No, you're not fine,
Rinoa said, her eyes swimming.
It's a scratch,
Squall assured her, forcing himself to his feet. He released his shoulder, but his hand remained immobile. Like he was actively trying not to move it.
Don't lose focus during a battle, Phineas,
Squall said, stepping towards him. He reached out with his left hand and took hold of the blade. He jerked it out of the armadillo, and the slick sound of the monster's blood nearly made Irvine sick. Because he couldn't help but think that it had come from Squall's shoulder instead.
That's how you die.
Squall. Rinoa ran towards him as he started walking away. She didn't resist giving Irvine a dark, dirty look as she passed him though. Angelo was no longer cowering, the armadillos had finished their assault or been killed off. There was no one else to stop them as they made their way back to the drawbridge. Irvine was suddenly quiet as he walked behind the two of them. Rinoa was alternating between throwing Irvine dirty looks and trying to resist grabbing Squall's injured shoulder. The bleeding had stopped thanks to the cure spell, but the blood that had already spilled would occasionally drip down onto the stone. But Squall hadn't said a word to him. He didn't even look mad. Irvine had never felt so guilty in all his life, and Squall didn't appear bothered at all. That only made it worse. The bright sunlight of the drawbridge only highlighted the damage and the guilt. Because now Irvine could see the bright blood from Squall's shoulder on his jacket and glove, and it made him physically sick. He had taken the shot on accident. Really, it had been more of a twitch of his fingers than any real decision to kill Squall. But regardless of how it had happened, Squall was now injured, carrying his sword in his non-dominant hand, and he had saved Irvine's life in return.
Squall, are you sure about this?
Rinoa asked, running in front of him before he could finish crossing the bridge.
You shouldn't be fighting like that. I'm fine. Stop saying you're fine. You're not fine.
She stomped her foot in agitation.
I told you both before, if we're doing this we're doing it. We're running out of time. So let's just finish up and get back to Deling City. I can rest there.
Squall. Rinoa moaned. She didn't want to hear him say that he was going to work more.
You can't keep doing this to me. You're giving me gray hair.
He actually looked up and inspected her hair. It was blowing gently in the breeze. The golden color of her highlights was shining in the sun. And he could still detect the flowery scent of whatever perfume or soap she used in the air. But not a gray hair in sight.
Your hair looks fine to me,
he said.
That's not what I meant,
she grumbled, but she couldn't help but reach up and touch it gently. She knew for a fact it had to be messy and frizzy. It was nice hearing the compliment nonetheless. Even if he didn't quite mean it the way she took it.
Maybe she's right, Squall,
Irvine said softly, stepping forward.
I don't need a GF that badly.
What was he talking about? He had been all for it a moment ago. Honestly, Squall was starting to miss Cell at this point. At least he, as a fellow seed, knew better than to worry over something as minor as the scratch on his arm. Even if the scratch was closer to a gouge. That was so big that it would likely scar even despite having 2 cure spells applied to it simultaneously almost immediately after sustaining it. The point was it wasn't bleeding and it wasn't life-threatening. He still had one more hand. Honestly, he was pretty sure he had received worse wounds training with Cypher.
We're already here,
he said, indicating over Rinoa's head with his chin.
Squall, please.
Rinoa put her hands together, almost begging him.
Demo ammo isn't easy, even if it does just graze you,
Irvine agreed.
Don't make me order you,
Rinoa insisted.
Stop it!
He stepped back from her, his eyes shielding themselves against her concern. Like that might do more damage to him than the gunshot.
If either of you wants to prevent me from fighting, then I suggest you fight more yourselves. Rinoa, get your float spells ready. Irvine, ammunition. Let's finish this and then I'll get medical attention.
Deliberately, Squall stepped around Rinoa and continued forward. It was all she could do to keep up with him. He was doing it again. That brash, cold voice of his invited no one to get closer. In looking at him out of the corner of her eye, Rinoa could see that it had worked on Irvine. He had a distant look in his own eyes, refusing to even look at Squall's back. She didn't understand. Irvine had shot him. Even if it was on accident, he still took a bullet while saving his life. Shouldn't he be upset? Shouldn't he be snapping? Quistis said that he only got truly mad at people he liked. So, by that math, he didn't like Irvine. And he had just pushed her away when she attempted to get closer to him. Squall wasn't reacting. Wasn't engaging. He was distancing himself. This wasn't introversion. Rinoa knew what that looked like. Even unfriendly people would engage, especially when they were angry over something. This was a deliberate attempt to separate himself from them. He was cutting himself off from them on purpose. He got angry at the people he liked not because he was comfortable enough around them to be angry, but simply because he did like them. And he didn't want to. So he pushed them away and made them not like him. The realization came to her in the short time it took to cross the bridge. It hit her like a ton of bricks and the implication of it was startling. Why was Squall so determined not to like people? Especially when he so clearly liked them. What was it in him that made him think pushing them away was the right thing to do? Then the three of them stepped into the heart of the tomb of the unknown king. The sarcophagus holding said king sat in pride of place in the center of the room. There was no need for Irvine's light because the room was so bright from the sunlight outside. And Minotaur was there, standing atop the sarcophagus. He was still as a statue until he saw them approaching. Then his body unfolded as he stood to his full height. He bared his teeth at them in anger, growling dangerously. All the marks from their battle were healed now after his time away from them spent connected back to the earth that was his strength.
Determined humans. You're going to pay. I have my big brother with me this time. Bro.
With a loud and disturbing rumbling, the ground started shaking under their feet. They could hear the water from the river outside splashing erratically with the movement. The three of them flailed, trying to keep their balance as the world upended around them. The stone in front of the sarcophagus rippled and looked like it melted away as a blue fur-covered hand reached up and threw it. Rinoa gasped as yet another GF pulled himself from the depths of the earth he had been resting in. His horns were yellow, his claws were slightly longer, and he pulled his mace up with him. He was almost an exact duplicate of Minotaur. In miniature.
Oh, my goodness!
Rinoa squealed, her eyes lighting up to see the smaller big brother. He was shorter than they were.
What's up, bro?
The tiny creature asked.
Squall, look how cute he is!
Rinoa said delightedly, almost grabbing Squall's injured arm in her excitement over the itty-bitty GF.
You think I'm cute, human?
He asked, his little voice nearly making her squeal again.
Then come over here and bend over, I'll show you how cute I am.
Rinoa's happy face fell and she took a step back away from the crude creature.
I changed my mind. Can you just capture it already? That was the plan,
Squall said, brandishing his weapon left-handed. Rinoa and the smaller GF moved at the same moment. She threw her hands out at Squall, yelling, "Float!" as the tiny GF jumped clear in the air. He came back down and the ground pitched violently. Rinoa fell with Irvine, but Squall remained floating in the air. He pushed down and jumped himself up to the ceiling. The GF made to jump again and Rinoa threw another spell, at Irvine this time. He perched himself on the wall and Rinoa was tossed about when the GF came down again. Squall launched himself from the ceiling. The GF lifted his mace and caught Squall's left-handed slash against the body.
A disadvantage of being weightless, little man, your attacks have no power.
The GF threw him back easily and Squall twisting in the air, landing above the door frame. His attack, however weak it had been, had given Rinoa the time she needed to cast a final float spell on herself. She pushed up against the ground and launched herself to the ceiling. She flipped just in time to land on her butt against the stone.
"Two more, Rinoa,"
Squall instructed.
"Diablos!"
Rinoa threw out both hands simultaneously. Once again, Minotaur reacted badly to being forced to fly. His elder brother though didn't look the slightest bit disturbed as he floated up from the ground. He continued giving the three of them dark looks and grinned.
"You've just made it easier for me to catch you. I won't allow anyone to destroy this tomb." "Why are you two so concerned with us trashing this tomb?"
Irvine frowned.
"No matter who it is, we won't allow this place to become defiled. Greedy grave robbers would never understand,"
Minotaur added, brandishing his own mace angrily.
"Bro, let me have the one in black. Mess up again, and I'll gut you myself, bro,"
the older one growled, nodding his permission. His eyes trained on Irvine, the older brother launched himself easily from the ground. He soared towards him with ease like the float spell didn't bother him. Irvine dove out of the way and the older brother hit the wall. Stone shattered and cracked under his power. Squall, happy to oblige him, charged at Minotaur. The bigger brother swung his mace out. Squall dodged it midair, grabbed the staff, and let Minotaur swing him around until his boot planted into his face. Squall kicked off again and Minotaur flailed. Rinoa looked between Irvine and Squall, torn for a moment. Help the injured seed, or help the not as skilled student? Oh, forget it. Irvine had shot Squall. She hoped he got a little roughed up. She turned and aimed her blaster. Unlike Squall's weapon, she didn't need to be able to put her weight behind the Valkyrie. It shot with the same power regardless of her. Faster now, sharper and far more accurate, her blade sliced cleanly through the air. It slipped around Squall and cut through Minotaur's arm. He roared angrily, directing hateful eyes at her. Both of them were stuck, neither of them comfortable moving in the lack of gravity. Rinoa caught the blaster and let out a breath. She did not like fighting. A loud shotgun blast followed by the louder shattering of stone turned her attention from Squall and back towards Irvine in time to see the older brother's mace explode with a hail of demo ammo and stone. Irvine, who had been backed into a corner, grinned at the weapon's destruction.
"How good are you without your weapon, Pipsqueak?"
Irvine asked, smirking.
"Till better than you, mortal,"
he returned. He lifted his fist and broke it down with a cry against the stone wall Irvine was perched upon. The fracturing off the walls threw Irvine off of the wall and left him floating out in no man's land with no way to move in any direction. The GF launched himself from the wall and tackled Irvine. The two of them flew across the burial chamber and slammed against the far wall. The younger brother had his hand around Irvine's neck, staring him down despite his tiny size. Rinoa lifted her arm to help him, but needn't have bothered. Irvine cocked his gun at an odd angle and took a shot that did little more than graze the GF's side. It was enough, however, to get him to release his hold. Irvine took in great gulps of air, sputtering a bit, his throat sore. The GF, thrown back from the force of the gunshot, growled as his blood peppered the ground below. Irvine let out another shot, then another, that the GF swiftly avoided. Rinoa turned back to where Squall was trading blows with Minotaur. The hollow clang of metal on stone echoed loudly between the two of them as Minotaur's mace and Squall's sheer trigger bounced off of one another. But Squall was losing ground. Fighting left-handed made him slower and weaker than usual. Minotaur had figured that out and was trying to press his advantage. Rinoa aimed again. The blaster fired with a soft click. The Valkyrie was singing as it rushed through the air and dove towards Minotaur. The tip of the blade embedded into Minotaur's right arm, making his roar out in pain. Rinoa flicked the return switch and called the blade back. The force of it yanking out sent blood flying, and Minotaur's arm dangled there, useless now. Rinoa caught the Valkyrie again and beamed. There, that evened the odds a bit.
Bro, that girl.
The elder brother looked away from Irvine and towards Rinoa. He traced the blood and blur fur on her weapon over to his brother's arm and he growled at her.
Okay, mortal, gonna need you to stop.
The older brother jumped down towards the ground. His open palm slammed against the stone just a moment before Float forced him back up. Just long enough for him to create another stone mace out of the rocks there. He turned and flung the half-formed thing up. Rinoa screamed. She felt a swoop in her belly like the ground had dropped out suddenly from beneath her feet. Wind rushed by her face and her eyes snapped open to see the ground rushing towards her. The float spell was wearing off already. She stopped suddenly right above the ground and she heard the elder brother's mace explode against the ceiling where she had been. Gravel and dust floated down around her. She twisted her body around and the float spell kept her knees from hitting the ground. She felt a rush of purely masculine smugness from Diablos as he made no hesitation to tell her that she could thank him for saving her hide. A float spell might keep her from hitting the ground, but he, as the master of gravity, could still manipulate her weight. Rinoa laughed and pushed herself away from the floor. She shot back up towards the ceiling and the elder brother growled at her.
Hey! I'm your opponent, Tiny!
Irvine yelled, shooting at him to catch his attention. Squall and Minotaur, both using their non-dominant hands, were back on even ground, metaphorically speaking. And when it came to fighting with the disadvantage, Squall was more experienced. Cypher often used to try debilitating him to make the fun last. With a wide swing, Squall knocked the mace from Minotaur's hands. The beast watched it go with wide eyes and turned back in time to see the barrel of Squall's gun blade pointed at his chest. A single ammo-piercing round threw him backwards. His body slammed against the wall and he stayed there, breathing hard and unable to move.
Sorry, bro,
he growled.
You gotta stop him.
The elder brother growled low and deep.
Gonna kill you all for that.
Squall turned, leaning his gun blade against his shoulder as he looked back at Irvine. Rinoa knew that look. She had seen it before aimed at her. He was watching how Irvine fought. He wasn't going to help. And if he wasn't going to help, Rinoa wasn't going to help either. Irvine was shooting one-handed now, using his other to prepare ammo that he changed out quickly, so there was only a minor break in between his firing. The elder brother was jumping out of the way. One wall, then another. To the ceiling, down, then to the side. One jump ahead of the bullets at all times. Until he jumped in front of Rinoa. Then Irvine cursed, jerking up his hand, and the shot he had automatically taken smashed a hole in the ceiling. Rinoa jumped backwards, away from the GF. The GF simultaneously jumped forward, towards Irvine, who was trying to reload again after his pattern had been so roughly broken. The GF lowered his head. Irvine dropped his arms down. He caught the GF against his forearms but couldn't totally prevent his horns from opening, twin puncture wounds on either side of his abdomen. The heat of his blood trailed down to the hem of his pants. Irvine grunted in pain as the GF pinned him against the ceiling, forcing him upwards and digging the horns in deeper. His gun slipped from his numb hands and slammed to the ground. The two of them struggled against each other for a moment. Irvine planted his feet against the ceiling, trying to push himself down and force the GF off of him. Squall looked down as the float spell wore off. His booted feet hit the ground. If the spell had worn off on him, then it was only a matter of time before. He looked back up to where Irvine was pushing. It took a few moments, but the spell started wearing off on him as well. Irvine's eyes opened as he realized he was about to get slammed to the ground under his own weight plus the power of the GF's strength. Instead of fighting further, he suddenly stopped struggling.
What's he doing?
Rinoa frowned at his sudden stillness. The corner of Squall's mouth turned up slightly. The spell faded and left Irvine suspended above the GF, whose spell had not yet faded. But the GF grunted because now Irvine's full weight was being laid against him. He growled and turned, throwing Irvine towards the ground. Irvine twisted so he landed on his feet. He jumped forward, scooped his gun up. He turned and fired in one smooth, quick motion. The GF, unprepared for such a move, cried out as the shotgun shells peppered across his body. Blood fell down against the stone and Irvine had to roll away to avoid it. He grunted in pain as doing so twisted the new holes in his stomach. He had no cure spells to take away the pain. Rinoa thought he deserved it for shooting Squall. Squall still threw a cure spell at him. He was far more mature than she was. She almost resented him for it even as she respected that he was being the bigger man in the situation. As the magic of the spell settled into his blood, Irvine stood up straight and patted for his stomach as though to make sure the wounds were still there. His hands came back bloody and he made a face at the sight of it on his fingers.
Give up?
Irvine asked, grinning, lifting his gun to his shoulder, totally arrogant. The GF was breathing hard against the ceiling, growling at them with one eye shut against the pain as he held his hand against the chest as though to stop the bleeding.
I die before I allow grave robbers to desecrate this tomb. Getting a little dramatic, aren't we?
Irvine laughed.
You might as well kill me, because I won't stop fighting. I would sooner destroy a pump action than a creature like you. Besides, I know what happens when GFs die. I still plan on making it out of this tomb.
The GF's face moved up in a grin.
Can't trick you, I still won't allow you to destroy this sacred place. We are the guardians here, and we won't allow you to desecrate it. I think you misunderstand,
Squall said, stepping forward.
We're not grave robbers.
The GF's eyes widened, then narrowed in disbelief.
Now lies, you take me for a fool. The only thing we wanted from this tomb was the GF said to reside here,
Irvine promised.
I have no intention on harming the tomb itself. Whoa!
Rinoa said as she started coming back down to the earth. She landed daintily beside Squall and smiled up at the GF.
Did you know the king entombed here?
Minotaur growled from the wall.
He was a dear friend of ours many years ago. Our first and only master. When he was laid to rest here, we promised to protect him in death as we failed to do in life.
Rinoa sighed.
That's so sweet. It's very honorable,
Squall nodded once. Irvine groaned as he straightened his hat.
Hein. I can't very well try to claim a GF that's already got such a good purpose in life. What?
The elder brother's eyes widened as he and his brother started floating back down. His hooves hit the ground as his brother crumpled against the wall. In connecting to the earth, they immediately started healing. Neither tried to attack though.
You have defeated us, it's your right to claim us. You won't be happy traveling with me. Not when you could be fulfilling this purpose.
Irvine winked at him.
It's fine. I'll take the glory of the victory, and you can remain here to protect your friend.
The GF's face softened as he straightened, the wounds in his chest fading.
Thank you, human, for understanding. Hey, I get it. I know what it's like to want to protect something from your past. Sometimes, the past is all you have. So it's important to cherish it. Hey, Seed, I thought we were on a time limit here? What are we still doing loafing around for? Waiting on your lazy ass, Kineas,
Squall returned, sheathing his blade.
Minotaur, you alright? Of course I am, puny one. You are a strong opponent. Do you wish to go another round? I think I'll pass,
Squall said as Rinoa laughed.
Thank you,
the older one said again, nodding his head to them.
The exit is very easy to find from here, you need only walk forward and you shall be free. It was an honor, You know. I don't even know your name.
Irvine grinned at them.
I am called Sacred, the honor is ours. Sacred. Minotaur.
Irvine tipped his hat at the two of them in turn.
Shall we, guys? Yeah. I want to get Squall back to the hotel so he can rest. And maybe a med clinic. Actually, let's just go to the med clinic first. I told you, I'm fine.
Rinoa started telling him again that he didn't know the meaning of the word as the three of them started towards the exit. The sound of moving stone behind them had them all turning quickly. Squall was already reaching for his weapon, immediately thinking that the two brothers had betrayed them. The movement of stone wasn't coming from either brother. Both of them looked just as surprised to hear it as the three of them. The lid of the sarcophagus was being pulled back. A cloud of dust erupted from within. The being of light and dust that rose from the coffin wearing ancient armor froze the room. Rinoa grabbed Squall's uninjured arm and hid behind him as his hand tightened on the hilt of his blade. He didn't know what he could do against something non-corporeal though.
Master!
The brothers breathed at the same time. Squall looked over to them, then over to the being rising from the coffin.
Ah, thank goodness,
the being said, stretching.
Feels good to be free. You know, I've been thinking. Why do we have to entomb those traveling to the other world? It does make moving on quite difficult. I think I would have preferred being buried in the earth.
His eyes moved over to the brothers and a soft smile came over his face.
My friends, you've done more than enough to fulfill your vow to me. A vow that I maintain was unnecessary. You were not the cause of my death. Please, friends, leave this place. See the world again. Fight as mighty guardians as you once did with me.
The sun shined through the room and a breeze flew in off of the water. And just like that, the being of the dust blew away into nothingness, like he was never there. The younger brother was wiping quickly at his face. The older's eyes were downcast.
Nope.
Rinoa declared, turning and walking out.
Yep,
Squall agreed, walking after her. So not his area of expertise. Irvine watched him go with a grin.
Nice to see there's one thing that guy can't do.
He turned back to the brothers who remained staring at the sarcophagus.
Sacred? Minotaur? Hey, I don't know if I can promise you the world, but I can promise that I'm probably going to be hanging around that guy for a while. I've got a past to chase, and a path to take. I don't know where it's going, but I know I don't have any choice but to walk down it. If you want to come with me, you and I can be friends. If you want to stay here and cherish your memories, then I respect that. It's up to you. Ah, the sun.
Rinoa beamed, letting the light wash over her as she stepped out of the tomb. It felt good to breathe fresh air again.
Let's go. We're almost out of time and the drive back will take a little while.
Squall said, stepping past her.
Seriously? When do you turn off? I want to know so I can capture the moment for posterity. And to prove that you're not an alien. Zone and Watts were taking bets.
Squall didn't dignify that with an answer. He moved to the rented car and opened the front door. As he did so, Irvine was stepping from the tomb. There was a grin on his face.
Hey, Squall. You gotta teach me how to use magic. Also, lend me some magic. Get your own magic, Irvine,
Squall returned, sitting down into the car. Rinoa smiled between them as she slid into the passenger seat. End of chapter.